media and impacting everything. I'm Osman Faruqi. I'm here with Scott Mitchell. Scott, my good friend, how you doing?
Man, I'm doing good. It feels good to finally be doing this with you after a lot of chat. Here we are, and yeah, it's the start of, I think, a pretty exciting journey that each of us don't know exactly where it's going to go, but man, there's no one I'd rather be doing it with than you, so it's pretty exciting. But Oz, I've got to ask, I haven't gotten to watch a lot of stuff in the last week, a lot of TV and things, getting ready to launch this with you, and I know that there's some other people who've been hanging out for some advice on what to watch. Your old podcast, The Drop, you did a lot of chat on what people should be watching, and there have been listeners hanging out for 9 months, so I know I need some recommendations. They probably need some recommendations. Spill, dude. What have you been watching? What's good?
I feel guilty, man, admitting that I've been watching a lot. You know, we've been building this podcast in the background, and maybe it reflects who's been putting in more work and who's been staying up late at night watching shows.
No.
There's going to be one thing I mentioned, and it's partly because I know that you're in the bag for this show, but I also think people need to know about this show. It's also been the thing that's got me the most excited in the past week, so it feels like honest to talk about it. It's a little show called Andor. And look, you and I, we're in the camp for Star Wars. We are big Star Wars heads. You a little bit more than me.
Absolutely.
You've read like the books and stuff. You know about some guy called Thrawn.
Admiral Thrawn, baby. Mara Jade. Justice for Mara.
Yeah, I have no idea what that is, but obviously I like movies and I like sci-fi stuff, so I like Star Wars. But Andor is a show, even if you're not a Star Wars nerd. It's on Disney+. It's written by Tony Gilroy, the guy who did the Bourne movies. He's great at writing about capitalism and spying and the deep state and the CIA and all this kind of stuff. And so he's taken the Star Wars universe, essentially, and just used that to tell a pretty like Marxist story about revolution and class and what bonds people together and the gears of fascism. And obviously Star Wars is a story about a big, dark, evil empire, but he kind of boils it down to how do these things work day to day? Who are the so-called normal people who are willing to deport illegal migrants, for example, or destroy entire countries and planets to mine their resources? So it's very topical, very relevant show right now. It's also very fun. It's a spy thriller. There's a lot to recommend. I'm kind of sad you haven't seen it yet because I'd love to talk to you about it.
No.
Maybe in future episodes we can just pivot to being a Andor watch-along podcast.
Can't wait to get into season 2, dude. I knew that you'd be wanting me to, so I will get in.
Look, who knows? We might be talking about Andor down the track on Lamestream. But we're also going to tell you a little bit about exactly what Lamestream is. We're going to talk to you about what's coming up on this show in a minute. But before that, Scott and I thought we'd touch on why we created this podcast and what we're hoping to do with it. Now, you and I, Scott, we've spent our entire careers working in the news media. We met working at the ABC, I think like 7 or 8 years ago. I think pretty quickly after we started working together, we realized that we had a pretty similar perspective on, I guess, the role of the media and how it's operating in Australia in particular right now. I think we both have this deep appreciation for the history of journalism, what it can do, what it does offer in terms of holding powerful people and institutions to account. But over the period that we've known each other, man, and gone on to work for different organizations, we've also seen readership and engagement with mainstream media in Australia just totally collapse. We've seen trust in media collapse. We've seen a pretty accepted right-wing shift in the tone of the coverage of most Australian news outlets, honestly. But at the same time, the need for real independent journalism has never been higher, right?
Yeah, man. Like, you know, I've been in media like 16 years this year, and I read an article or hear a report these days, and sometimes like it can sound like it's from an alien planet. Like it's not describing what is happening in front of all of our eyes a lot of the time. And that's someone, you know, I'm pretty news pilled. I'm a news junkie. I'm sort of able to read a bit of the subtext of what's going on that's maybe not overt. And so I know a lot of like my friends are even more lost than I am looking at what comes out of a lot of mainstream media these days. And really, you know, a lot of the big media companies have sort of with their actions sort of given up on talking about issues that a lot of younger people care about. And so we think I know that we both think it's a really important time to do this, and that a lot of people are looking for different ways to engage with the media and understand it. And it's a big reason we've launched this. And we both left our jobs in the mainstream media last year. You were culture editor for both the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, and me, I left running the 7am podcast. And after walking away, talking a lot, we decided the only way that we could sort of do something like this was to do it fully independently, which means we're going to be able to, have conversations that people won't hear from a lot of the big companies. We're going to be able to report on stuff that would be hard to do, stories that would be tough if we were employed at the big media companies as well. So that's going to be hopefully what we're doing. But Oz, what can people expect from the show?
Yeah, just before I get into that, it's funny you mentioned like us sort of being off the leash. I ran into a former colleague of mine at The Age who, very, very nice person working in the Good Food team. And they're like, I've noticed, you're on Blue Sky, you're posting a bit there. And like, it's great to just see you speak honestly about how you feel about what's going on in Australian media right now. And I was like, man, you have seen nothing yet. Don't just strap in. If you're excited about my very tepid Blue Sky posting, wait till we kick off Lamestream. But in terms of what we are planning to do with Lamestream, every week we're going to talk about a couple of big stories, where they came from, what they tell us about the way the media works in Australia right now, and how it intersects with other big, powerful institutions like politics, business, sports, arts, and culture. It's going to be a bit of everything for everyone here in terms of the kinds of stories that we cover. We're also going to have some fun. We're going to break our own stories as well, do some original reporting, maybe interview people, kind of shed a light on stories that we think are not being covered adequately by the rest of the media landscape.
And it's worth mentioning that the first edition of our newsletter is out today with a bit of goss, and people can subscribe at lamestream.com.au. And basically that's how, we're hoping to sort of fund being able to keep doing this. So any support is greatly appreciated. Get on and subscribe to the newsletter.
Yeah, lamestream.com.au. It's another fun way that Scott and I will be sharing stuff throughout the week. We'll have the podcast. We'll also have a weekly newsletter, which will have breaking news, goss, recommendations, a lot of worthwhile things to check out. We'll remind you about that link at the end of the episode too. And normally these episodes will drop on Thursdays, but because this is our first week, and because it's the week of the federal election, there's just too much to talk about, man. So we're going to have 2 episodes this week, this one and another one on Thursday, which will be our regularly scheduled programming. So on today's show, there is unsurprisingly a bit of an election theme. We're going to take a closer look at the so-called influencer election and how podcasts, like Lamestream, streamers and TikTokers have become a big part of the media story of this particular Australian election campaign. Scott and I, we're also going to share some of our favorite underrated narratives from this election, the ones that we think are missing from mainstream coverage but deserve a little bit more attention and scrutiny as we head into Election Day this Saturday. We're also going to take a closer look at a new campaign launched by Australia's biggest media companies to try and stamp out racial hatred. Big topic. This campaign has received the endorsement of the Prime Minister, but it's raised some questions, mainly from you and I, about hypocrisy, considering News Corp, one of the backers of this campaign's entire modus operandi when it comes to issues of race in Australia, and Nine's willingness in particular to promote attacks on welcome to country ceremonies, another very topical issue right now. But first, Scott, the election. It is this Saturday. Can you believe it? How have you found this campaign, the way it's been covered by the media so far?
Feels like no time at all, and yet like it's crawled at a snail's pace. I think, Oz, if you take a temperature gauge of how most journalists are feeling about covering it, they themselves privately would say that they've been quite bored by the entire thing, which is maybe nice for people to know that the poor people covering this, a lot of them, I think, are quite bored by it. But I have to say that one thing I have found great watching this election is that I think the press conferences, if you can watch the live interaction, I feel like one good thing about bored journalists is when they're in a pack and they get bored, they sort of start to pick at things. And we've seen some great meltdowns at press conferences. Andrew Hastie had one over his past comments that women shouldn't be in the military. But maybe my favourite is Amelia Hamer, the Liberal candidate for Kooyong, getting absolutely roasted, kind of doorstopped on the street by Rachel Dexter of The Age, because Hamer, at the beginning of the campaign, talked a lot about the pain of being a young renter in a pretty affluent part of Melbourne like Kooyong, how hard it was, only for it to come out that she does rent in Kooyong, but she does own 2 homes elsewhere, including one home she owns in London. So maybe not the generational renter that she is fighting on behalf of. So that's been fun, Oz.
My favorite part of that story, and in terms of like how journalism works, right? You have these moments where you might get a tip, you might hear something that, someone has done something that they said that they didn't do. In this case, Amelia Hamer, as you say, portraying herself as a renter. You get a tip maybe that they've got a property, and you do the legwork and you find out they've got a property. And that can go one of 2 ways in terms of like going well for you. You can get the politician, in this instance, Amelia Hamer, to say, you know what, you got me, I do own a property, I'm going to like give you a statement about it. Or it can like go up a notch, which is what happened here, where Amelia Hamer not only confirmed she owned the London property, but also then disclosed that she owned a second property in Canberra that I don't think the reporter knew about. And just like, that is gold, getting that in. You've caught me out, and also here's a bunch of other stuff I've done that is not quite right. And that story just became one of the like defining moments of that campaign, didn't it?
That's the good stuff about election campaigns. As silly as it can be, those moments are gold.
Yeah, and I think particularly this campaign is, like you said, everyone we know reporting on it is having a pretty tough time, whether they're on the campaign bus with the leaders or whether they're trying to interview regular people about the election. There's just not a lot of enthusiasm for this campaign. So having those moments like the Hamer situation has been really satisfying to watch. But I think one part of this campaign, or at least the media conversation around this campaign, that has been pretty interesting has been the focus on the role that's been played by podcasts and influencers. And I think this maybe felt inevitable. And you and I talked about this around the time of the US presidential election last year, when podcasting became this big focus. I mean, you and I have a vested interest in this, in that we are one making a podcast, but we've spent the last few years of our lives in like news podcasting. So having everyone else say, man, podcasts or elections are won and lost, it's like, cool, man, thanks for discovering what we've been doing for the last 5 years. In particular, I think Donald Trump's appearances on Joe Rogan and Theo Von, and Kamala Harris's appearance on Call Her Daddy, led to like maybe too much of a focus on the role of podcasts.
So many think pieces written about like, what does the podcast say about the modern political whatever? There's inundated with them.
And I think Democrats in the US in particular seem like totally spooked by the Rogan thing, right? Like, you read all these stories from Politico and Axios, and it's like Democrats are trying to find a candidate who can go on Joe Rogan. If we can get a guy who can go on Rogan, like, we've won the election. I'm not sure that is like the key takeaway of the current US political moment, but I think that speaks to just how there's a new media landscape emerging, and the tools and the tactics of strategists on both sides haven't really caught up with it. And I'm starting to see the same thing happen in Australia, right? So the role that these influencers are playing in politics, to my mind, shouldn't really be that surprising, because there are fewer and fewer people watching the evening news or listening to ABC radio or talk back in the morning, even reading newspapers or even reading news websites. You read the polls, you look at surveys. More and more Australians, millions of them, and particularly younger Australians, people under the age of 40 or 45, going to YouTube, social media, TikTok, podcasts, influencers for their news and information generally. So it kind of makes sense that in the context of an election campaign, that's where they'll go to look for information about candidates and policies. And as I mentioned, neither you or I are strangers to this. We both used to work on a daily news show called 7am. We interviewed politicians, right? And I think we both found that in recent years, politicians themselves were more eager to come on those shows because they could, one, reach a different audience, like a younger audience it's very hard for them to normally engage with, but also like a lot of people, and in some instances more people than were listening to certain ABC programs.
Yeah, like during my time at 7am, we had like Albanese came on the show, Bant came on the show, Chalmers came to talk to us the day after the budget. But the one thing that I think is interesting and worth sharing about that is that the number one thing that all of the press officers were interested in was our audience data. That's the number one thing that determined whether they came and what they thought of the pitch. And I think it's kind of interesting that, at least in my experience doing that, a lot of the press officers, even just a year ago, were pretty surprised by the number of people that they could reach on podcasts. Now, obviously, this conversation from the US has trickled down. As one can expect, Oz, do you feel like that conversation has just trickled down to Australia with even more nuance, clarity, intellectual rigor as it's reached our shores?
Yeah, it's classic Australian fashion. We do something the US does later and like somehow worse. Look, it is an interesting one because we're talking about this, right? Like, I'm not trying to dismiss this idea of the podcast election entirely. There's a really interesting shift happening. It's been happening in media for a while. That is people ditching mainstream media and finding these newer voices on social media. And what is taking longer to catch up is how politicians are reacting to it. So eventually it was going to come to a head. This election, the first time it's been a real, deliberate, concerted strategy. I mean, we've seen the story recently from the ABC that Albanese's office has actually engaged the company that runs the Batuta podcast, for example, to give them strategy and advice on how to approach and deal with podcasting this election cycle. But it started before that. I mean, Peter Dutton got the ball rolling last December with a very friendly interview with this Australian diver called Sam Fricker. He backed it up with a conversation on Mark Burris, the kind of business guy show. Albanese sort of took it to another level, right? He did an interview with Burris. He spoke to the Daily Oz, the Squiz, the Batuta Advocate, these cricket podcasts, Willow Talk, and the Great Cricketer. And the one I think that got the most attention, Abby Chatfield's podcast. Abby's been interviewing people she's interviewed Anthony Albanese, she interviewed Adam Bant, the leader of the Greens, she interviewed Jackie Lambie, the leader of the Jackie Lambie Network. So it is, I think, a fair topic to interrogate, and it's a fair topic for media organizations to cover because it is a significant shift. I think the issue that I have with it is more, not just the kind of attention it's gotten, but the you mentioned the word nuance, right? Like, I think obviously it's kind of interesting that there are now politicians going on podcasts. In a way, I think that's like the least interesting part of it. The more interesting part of it is what is different about this way of covering politics. Why are politicians potentially more interested in going on these shows than doing traditional interviews? Like, I think if influencers want to talk about political issues, good on them. That's their prerogative. And it's great to see people go from reality TV to talking about issues that matter in the world right now. But the nature of those interviews, the way that they're conducted, the topics they cover, the experience they have, their confidence in pushing back on very powerful people, that to me is the interesting part of this conversation. And I think from a political perspective, you can certainly see why someone like Anthony Albanese, even someone like Adam Bant, Peter Dutton, would prefer to be interviewed by a former Olympic diver or a cricketing podcast or a satirical news podcast like the Batuta Advocate, rather than someone from the Sydney Morning Herald or the ABC. Because ultimately, and I think this has been borne out by how these interviews have played out, the level of engagement, the depth of experience of doing a political interview isn't there. So these guys are going on platforms that are largely safe. They might even be overtly pro the candidate. In Abby Chatfield's case, for example, she did a lengthy prelude to the Albanese interview and said, look, this is not going to be an unbiased interview. I actually really like Anthony Albanese and I want him to be Prime Minister over Peter Dutton. So if you're Anthony Albanese, you're like, great, I can get exposed to Abby's hundreds of thousands of followers and she's just going to tell everyone how great I am, right? And so I'm interested to get your vibe on that because I think there's obviously a massive benefit to politicians ditching the kind of exclusive reserve of the Canberra press gallery and going to these different platforms. But is there a risk in losing the kind of combative political interview or the kind of interview that can actually expose where a politician might be stumbling or inconsistencies in their approach if they're choosing to just speak to safer political interviewers who are explicitly saying that they support them?
Yeah, I think that, I mean, what makes this conversation really hard to have in this country is that what ends up happening is that the traditional media get sort of clutch their pearls, that influencers dare to do political interviews. And I don't think that that is quite right because I think that, one, I think new media voices are like incredibly important. And two, that having a bias, I think, in kind of political, if you're covering politics, you are allowed to have a bias. However, I think that the thing that then makes it hard on the other side is that the people within the kind of influencer sphere, the new media sphere, often come out of, it's a media environment that is about personality and is about personalities talking, and they find, I feel like their reaction against the criticism of them is often like, they're haters, we don't need to listen to any of it, we don't need to take these critiques seriously, when there are I think genuine things about, I think you can go into an interview being like biased towards a certain ideas around, say, climate change, the war in Gaza, whatever. You can have declared things about that. But in a political interview, I think it is fair enough to hold the host accountable for, are you fact-checking this person? Are you asking them difficult questions? You might be biased to be friendly to them, but politicians, they earn taxpayer wages. They are responsible to the electorate. It is your job to hold them accountable, even if you have sympathies. And I think it's okay for the audience, for us, for people in traditional media, to kind of scrutinize these influencers and what they're doing without that criticism being like just being a hater, being a critic, criticism can be also like positive and not fully dismissive of the role that new media might have. So it's like, that is the conversation that I think this whole thing is sorely lacking, that doesn't sort of seem to give these people their due of, they're allowed to engage in politics, they're citizens, they're allowed to do this, but mark them to a standard of like, if you're going to do this, then disclosure with your audience, transparency, holding politicians accountable is the right thing to do.
Yeah, I think the disclosure point is an interesting one. We'll talk about that in a second, but I just wanted to go back to a thing you mentioned about fact-checking, right? Like marking these people, like doing the interview. I think this is what we're kind of coming to. That's not really the most exciting thing. The act of the interview is not interesting. It's like, how was it done? Who is it serving? And is it holding, in the case of Anthony Albanese, like quite literally the most powerful person in the country to account? I think this is the reason why the Abby Chatfield interview in particular drew so much attention. A lot of people saying this is great, and a lot of people, including me, I wrote a piece about it saying that I think it kind of missed the mark. And I say that as someone who has watched Abby's career and followed it closely for a long time, and followed her on Instagram for a long time, and listened to her podcast for a long time, and was interested to see her engage in this election. She's been very vocal on issues like climate change and gender equality, on Israel's war in Gaza. She's, interviewed prominent Palestinians about it. She's not shied away from describing Israel's actions as a genocide. But then when she did this interview, in the prelude before the actual conversation with Albanese, she had to edit in this caveat apologizing for not really asking Albanese tough questions or confronting him with the idea that Israel was actually implementing a genocide in Gaza. And so what frustrated me in that interview is, okay, you've got someone who's got a set of political views and beliefs. That opportunity to actually ask the most powerful person in the country about them is pretty rare, and then they don't do it. And then on the issue of fact-checking, I mean, there were moments where Albanese was allowed to described the Greens' climate change policy. If it was implemented, it would turn off the lights in the studio in which they were recording. I mean, that's just one, absurd, and two, a News Corp on renewable energy policy. And Abby, who would consider herself to be someone who cares about climate change, just sort of nodded along and went with it. And so at that point, does that become a political interview, or has that just become a platform for a political candidate to propagandize to an audience, just hearing it? The purpose of interviews isn't just to get a message of a candidate out. That's why a candidate buys ads. That's why a candidate does their own Instagram videos. That's why they put billboards and cornflakes up. The point of an interview is to interrogate them about those beliefs. And I think in this election cycle, for all the talk of the podcast election, there hasn't been a lot of that happening on these platforms.
And I'd add, one thing that I understand fully why a lot of the people on the podcast end of this bristle at a lot of the way that the mainstream media have talked about it, that I think is legitimate, is that I feel like a lot of it kind of comes across as tut-tutting from establishment to kind of young people and to women, and there's misogyny tied up in that and all that kind of stuff. And so that made me very happy when I thought I should mention this example. I saw that Albanese appeared on The Rest is Politics with Alistair Campbell. Yeah. And
your favorite podcast,
establishment
right?
Media love a guy like Alistair Campbell, love him. And I thought it was really interesting that, he asked Albanese some real softballs. Obviously, he's UK Labour. Anthony Albanese is Australian Labour. There's a relationship between those parties. So it was a pretty friendly crowd. And Alistair Campbell asked him a question about like how he was so nice in Australian politics, and he's such a nice guy. And Australian politics is this very like bare knuckle politics. And
Mr. Albanese,
and,
your campaign has the momentum of a runaway freight train.
Exactly. It was like, and have you been too nice? Albanese just got this wonderful free kick to talk about what a nice guy he is now. Anyone who knows anything about Anthony Albanese, think what you like of him. You might think he's a great prime minister or a terrible prime minister, but for like decades, he was the attack dog for the Labor Party in Parliament. He did not shy away from confrontation. He's a very like formidable factional player. And so I would say, you look at an Alistair Campbell and he is just as worthy of this criticism of the influencer election. He's not a journalist. He is, for want of a better word, a celebrity in the podcast sphere. So I feel like that can help open this up where it's not just a conversation about young people and young comedians or whatever. There are lots of kind of concerning things about politicians using safe territory, safe personalities who they exploit for their audience, really.
No, it's a really, really good point. It's a really good point. I think the other bit of this I want to touch on just briefly before we move on is, this idea of disclosure, right? Because one other element that has emerged in the last couple of weeks is that there have been a lot of influencers, including all the ones we've mentioned so far, who have just done these interviews because they want to interview them. They just think this is a good, useful thing for them to do with their platforms. It's also emerged, though, that there have been some influencers who've been paid either by political candidates or by other politicians and parties to conduct interviews. And in some instances, that payment was not disclosed. We mentioned already before that the Prime Minister's been on 2 podcasts on the Batuta Advocate Network. They were not paid directly, but the company that owns those podcasts is working with the Prime Minister's office to do political strategy. That was not disclosed during the time of those podcast interviews being recorded and published. And some people say, well, people have to make a living and like look at News Corp, look at the way that they're in the tank for conservative politics in Australia. I would say I don't think your bar should be how the worst and perhaps least ethical media organizations in Australia operate. What's driving so much of this is people have good reason to not trust established media. So they're turning to newer voices. If those newer voices start kind of messing around with the ethical norms that have driven the way media works for a long time, like accepting money from politicians and not disclosing that, then you're at risk of, one, losing your audience and losing their trust, but just replicating the exact institutions that you're trying to critique and replace. I think that has been a really worrying trend, and I'm glad it's being exposed. I'm glad there are journalists looking into these relationships because it's pretty murky. Disclosure rules on social media are pretty easy to skirt around. The way that Australian campaign finance laws operate is like pretty loose as well. So having this kind of conversation, highlighting those ethical conundrums, I think is really important. I just think that I want new media to succeed, right? Not just because we've launched a podcast, but because I think it's really important for there to be a diverse, interesting media ecosystem. I don't want them to fall into the trap that has led the mainstream media into its current malaise.
And just quickly, basically, so people know, the environment we're operating in here is the AEC has said that if you're paid to do a podcast, then the podcaster needs to disclose that and put an authorized stamp on it. So that will happen. But the thing about it is, what there is really a grey area on is if the podcast has been paid for other work, if they've written a sketch for one of the parties, they've written an ad, they've done copywriting for them, they could get paid for that, not paid for the podcast, and that podcast is not electoral material. And we won't find out a lot about this stuff until maybe disclosures. Even then, we don't really know. So there's a lot of stuff that kind of could be going on that we don't really know, where people who have podcasts are being paid for other work by political parties, and that isn't being disclosed unless they volunteer it.
Absolutely. And I'm also aware of campaigns funneling payments to influencers and advising them how to talk about issues that doesn't require them to say, vote one for this politician. I think as soon as you bring in the vote message, that's when the AEC gets involved. But if you just say, highlight these issues that might support the interest of a set of candidates, and an influencer receives payment for that, they don't have to disclose that. Or at the very least, it's a very untested and unclear set of circumstances. And that, to me, is just like not a good result. It's happening a lot. I think after this election, when we finally do get some clarity about who spent what money where, some tough questions are asked, and we plan on doing that here on Lamestream as well for the newsletter and for the podcast. We will find out more about what went on, but it's hard to really justify, I think. Look, we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to break down some of the more interesting and underrated parts of this election campaign that Lamestream thinks deserve a little bit more attention. All right, Scott, for this conversation, you and I set ourselves the task of thinking a little bit about what we thought was missing from coverage of this campaign. I think that comes from us being election junkies, watching a lot of coverage of this campaign in particular, but also growing up in sort of political backgrounds, having dabbled in politics ourselves, and just kind of knowing what's going on behind the scenes too, and thinking about how you could create something a bit fun and a bit new for our listeners. So this could be like a political theme, could be a policy issue, could be a particular contest or a party we think that people need to be across. We've each come up with a couple, and I think the idea of this is to, one, clown the mainstream media for not covering things that we think are obvious and important and useful for people to understand, but also talk about them a little bit so we, at least, and our listeners, can appreciate and understand their significance. Talk about them a little bit so that at least we and our listeners can understand and appreciate their significance. Make sense?
Makes sense to me, or at least I hope it did, so we are doing the same segment.
We're about to find out, aren't we? Look, I'll start by sharing my first one. And this one might sound odd because I think to a lot of people listening to this show, it might seem obvious, but I actually still don't think it's getting enough attention, and that's what makes it interesting. And it's the fact that Peter Dutton is running what I think is quite possibly the worst Liberal Party campaign of all time. It's kind of extraordinary. And I guess why I think this is a funny one is because I think a lot of people agree that this is a pretty bad campaign. The polling for the coalition has tanked, and he's fumbling and backtracking on policies all the time. But it's not really being discussed quite that explicitly when you tune in to the 7 p.m. news, or you watch commercial TV news, or you listen to radio, or you read the newspapers. I think there's a couple of reasons for that, but the fall off is just so spectacular to me. This should just be the defining story of this election. It should be every day. There should be stories about what is going wrong with the Liberal Party. How did they fumble this? A little bit of that coming out, Paul Sakat at The Age has written some stories about tension between Peter Dutton's office and the Liberal campaign, but the same kinds of journalists also then seem to be going out of their way to say, but he won the last debate, so this could be his chance to really turn things around. And, he's gotten really good at telling journalists to shut up at press conferences. He's got a chance to win this one. And I mean, just to highlight this, how much of a slam dunk this should have been. And obviously this is not me saying I'm angry Peter Dutton isn't going to win the election, but think about the global political narrative over the past 12 months, his rise in the right, this idea that incumbents are being turfed out because of the economic situation, cost of living being such an issue in an Australian contest. He had the momentum, the polling was up, and now he's way behind. He started the campaign and his number one policy was weirdly, I want to force women to go back to the office and never see their children again, ending work from home, which is a bad enough thing to say, but then backflipping on it. So it's what do you actually stand for? Only real policy that seems to have cut through is a 25-cent fuel excise tax. I think this is a funny one because I think The Age has just started counting all the Bowsers he's going to, up to petrol station 14, but also they're just sort of stating that as fact and not pointing out this is a completely absurd way to run a political campaign. And the journalists, this is my point here, some criticism eking in, but they're largely covering it, pretending that this is still a real contest. And I want to ask you, based on your experience covering elections and your vibe about what's going on, I know you're talking to journalists on the campaign now, do they know this is bad and that they're just forced to say there's a close race? Because it's kind of think about a footy game, right? There can be a blowout, right? And maybe a team starts coming back, but that they're not going to win. The commentators are oh man, if Sydney score 6 goals in the next 7 minutes, they might be able to get this one over Port. We know that's not true, but the goal of the commentator in that context is to keep you watching because they want you to boost the ratings. They want you to watch the ads. They don't want you to turn off. That's the vibe I'm getting from what's going on with the political journalism right now. Does that make sense? Is that fair? Am I being too harsh?
I mean, I can't speak to exactly what the people who are making those decisions are thinking, but it certainly rings true to me that a lot of the kind of big commentary pieces are sort of trying to go, hey, keep reading, keep watching, this thing's tight. I will say that, I do think at the press conferences, you're seeing a lot of the journos who are kind of like actually having to be there. I think really Dutton is starting to get pretty on the ropes, and their tone in those press conferences are clearly starting to pick away at what's going on and the failures in his campaign. I mean, I think it's becoming so obvious that basically he was all ready to go with a very MAGA-style campaign. You know, even before the election was called, he announced this cut to public service. We're going to do Doge. We're going to do what Elon and Trump are doing. It just so happens that then Trump hits this tariffs stuff, becomes hugely unpopular in countries like Australia. And for whatever reason, the Liberals, I feel like, bailed out of that, and Dutton's been distancing himself from the early groundwork he laid. And it's almost like, at this point, would he actually be doing better if he stuck with all of that stuff than kind of backflipped and walked away from it? Because now no one really knows what he stands for, except Labor keep saying he's going to spend $600 billion on nuclear power.
Yeah, totally. What have you got, man? What's your first underrated election narrative?
My one is I've been loving watching some Sky News, and they went absolutely mental over this idea that how dare Anthony Albanese preference the Greens in his own seat over the Liberal Party. And they really thought they had a ripper on this one. Like, they ran on it all day. Watching Sky go wall to wall on this story made me start thinking, I am not reading or seeing much about the Greens that isn't sort of like how they affect the other parties. And I sort of think that is the underreported story at this election, because it's pretty fascinating. You've got like Adam Bant is going around with a giant prop toothbrush to TV appearances and like DJing at parties. And there's a huge amount at stake for him. And the campaign is kind of fascinating they're running. And so I tried to go to some of the outlets and sort of see what they'd written about the Greens. And, you know, like, this is just an example of what I'm talking about. But if you look at what the 9 newspapers have done since the election was called, you're going to find a lot of stories that kind of have headlines like this. Labor moves to punish Greens over Gaza stance, and it could play into the Liberals' hands. The multi-million-dollar campaign to oust Greens MPs from Brisbane. Nationals leader slams WA Greens Anzac Day dance party decision. Now, those are just some examples, but if you go anywhere, that's like most of what you'll see. And my problem with it isn't that it's critical. I think critical coverage is important, but it's sort of, none of these stories are actually about the Greens. They're all about what people say about the Greens. And like, you can't find a lot about what is actually going on, which I find very interesting also because of, you know, what we know about the demographics of Australia. Like, women under 35, way more likely to vote Greens than Coalition. And in fact, for women under 35, the Greens are tied with Labor as the most popular party. So it's like audiences like that are the exact audiences that, you know, I've been in countless meetings with news bosses scratching their heads going like, how do we reach more women under 35? Maybe cover the party that they would be interested in this election. And aside from like audience strategy, it's an amazing story. Like, the Greens spent this last parliament having this real, I think, internal battle over what they were going to be. And they ended up sort of resisting a lot of the government's agenda very loudly and held it up. But then in every case, ultimately cut a deal and voted for it. And it's really interesting to see what the verdict of the electorate is going to be on that. And it's a huge test for Bant. Like, did that kind of middle path of fighting hard but caving sort of keep a broad church? Or did they fight too hard and were too loud for maybe some older Greens voters who feel a lot of sympathy with the Labor left? You know, will they be alienated by that? Or are they kind of like younger, really angry renter voters who are like, you know, ultimately the Greens did vote for the half without getting additional stuff for renters. That's still kind of up for debate at this election. Did they secure enough for that? So it's really interesting. Now, very quickly, even though I would love to read this piece and more pieces like it, I should mention props to Dan Jervis-Brady at The Guardian, who's the only one I saw write anything that kind of goes into all of this. But apart from that, really, I couldn't find much. There's like one article from Paul Sakal that kind of is a temperature check on Bant's position as leader if things go badly, but that is really it. So I think it's a really underreported story, and what's happening with the Greens at this election is fascinating.
Yeah, good friend Paul Sakal getting a couple of shout outs. Great stuff, man. Keep it going. Look, I think the fact that what you just talked about then, the strategy of the Greens this cycle being making a big fuss but caving, like that's the most interesting thing I've heard about the Greens this election campaign. Like to me, that should be a focus of lots of stories. And just before I say more in terms of like disclosures for people who don't know this, my mother is a deputy leader of the Greens. I used to work for the Greens. I'm not involved anymore, and I write often quite critically about them, and I think we will talk about that, if not in this episode, next episode, and on the newsletter. I have lots of thoughts about the Greens' particular election strategy in this cycle, but yeah, it is odd that it's not there. I think you nailed why though. Like I think the kind of journalist class, and certainly the editor class at the moment, the people that have been running newspapers and working in them for a long time, they're from a generation and a demographic that sees the Greens as pesky upstarts who don't really belong in the political ecosystem. And so that's why they always define them in terms of how they are annoying Labor or the coalition or just causing a fuss. But for a huge chunk of Australians, the Greens are the only party they voted for, right? Like you mentioned the youth numbers. Like we've got polls showing that the Greens are the most populous party for people aged 18 to 24, even 18 to 35. They've overtaken the Liberal Party. And where do those people get their news and information about their party from? The good, the bad, the ugly? Like kind of nowhere at the moment. So I think there's a huge growing disconnect. And honestly, to go back to our earlier conversation, it's probably a lot of these people who are ditching the news and listening to Abby Chatfield and other podcasts because they just take for granted the fact that they care about climate change, housing, and Gaza, and the Greens do. And so they want conversations about that. So I think that is a real good issue. And I think it's going to become more resonant after the election, which I think brings me to my second underrated narrative. And this is about the consequences of a potential hung parliament and what happens if it turns out no major party can form a majority after the election. To very quickly explain that, there are 150 seats in the House of Representatives. To form government, one party needs at least 76 seats. If neither party has 76 seats, they need to turn to independents or minor parties to get them over that line. That's what happened in 2010 when Julia Gillard led a Labor government, became Prime Minister, supported by the Greens and some independents as well. Now, there has been a decent amount of coverage about the possibility of a hung parliament. The vote for Labor and the coalition is at historic lows. There are more minor party independent MPs than ever, and their vote is just going up. So if you look at the polls, there's a decent chance that neither party has a majority. We end up in that 2010 situation all over again. But what I'm surprised about, I think what's underrated here, is how little scrutiny or focus there's been on what actually physically happens in that situation. Whenever Anthony Albanese is asked what happens if there's a hung parliament, he just says, I'm not going to do any deals with the Greens. But if he's going to have to rely potentially on some kind of arrangement with independents and Greens. And I just don't understand how he can be allowed to say, his other line is, I'm campaigning for a Labor majority and I want Australians to elect a Labor majority. No shit, man. Like, obviously that's what you want, but that might not be the situation that occurs. So why are you not being pressed on exactly what you might compromise on, what your preferences might be in terms of who you want to work with? And I think the same is true for those independents and minor parties, particularly the Teals, and the way that they're discussing this issue or what they're being pressed on. A couple of the Teals, a couple of independents have said they've got a willingness to work with the coalition, but largely they aren't really being asked to be upfront public with who they want to back or what their negotiating priorities would be. And I find this kind of weird because this is entirely the point of an election campaign. You're supposed to say what you want to achieve and what your plan is for getting there. So it's odd to me there are so many candidates who aren't like, I really want emissions to be reduced by X amount and I'm going to back Anthony Albanese who'll get me there, or I'll back Peter Dutton if he gets me there. Like, to me, this is kind of what campaigning is about. Elections are also the only time where politicians face real accountability every 3 years. Right, this is a chance to get them on the record because they're shit scared about losing their seats and they want votes, right? So if we're not getting them on the record now about their approach, once the election is done and they're all in these quiet rooms working deals out, they can do whatever they want because they haven't committed to anything. We've missed that opportunity to actually get that information out of them before we vote. And it got me thinking, like, why isn't this happening? Like, why is the media simultaneously acknowledging that there's a really high chance of a hung parliament, but then stopping there? I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that big chunks of the media, particularly News Corp, they hate the idea of a hung parliament, right? So they've got to acknowledge its possibility, but they really don't want to talk about the power that the Teals and the Greens might have after the election. They don't want to give them more attention. This goes back to your earlier point. And I think so much of the news agenda is set by like News Corporation. And I think a lot of editors, even at places like the Nine papers, have that same antipathy towards the Greens or the Teals. And they just can't bring themselves to actually sit down and think about, okay, cool. If that's going to be the outcome, let's interview these people. Let's get Adam Bant to talk about what his priorities would be. It's like that happens a little bit, but not to the extent you'd imagine, considering where the polling is at and considering that in a week from today could be secret meetings between Peter Dutton and Anthony Albanese with a raft of independent MPs. Bob Katter could end up having an enormous amount of sway, right, after this election. I have no idea what the fuck Bob Katter's policies are right now. Like, does he still want to put a gun in every school? Like, this is a non-zero chance of that being a thing, and we're the first people to talk about it. It just feels a bit whack to me.
Yeah, and the other thing I'd say is, like, when it comes to the independents, everybody's saying that there might be more independents in this parliament than ever before, and a lot of them are backed by Climate 200, but there's a lot of them who are very different, who have come from very different political sensibilities.
Yeah, absolutely.
And as far as I've seen, they haven't really been pressed that much. And I think that part of the reason is that the most interesting questions to me come from like a progressive, probably bent that a lot of the papers and the ABC find difficult to do or just have a real distaste for. Because there's questions around like, okay, you're saying that you're a climate independent. That's what you're running on. You know, like if you are in negotiations with the Albanese government, will you hold out for, you know, like an improvement in the safeguard mechanism and the climate policies the government have that will actually get us, you know, well beneath the targets, better than we currently. Will you hold out for those things? You know, we don't really know whether, you know, they proclaim to be climate independence, but would they hold out for certain things? They certainly didn't in this parliament. They voted through the government's, you know, measures eventually. David Pocock did hold out for some amendments to that. But apart from that, they pretty much passed the agenda pretty clean. We don't really know what they'll hold out for. And that's like interesting to get them on the record for if there are progressive voters in their electorate who want to know how much are you going to hold out on this government for a deal? What will you demand from them to join them?
Absolutely. And just quickly, there's even like a bunch of potential new climate independents that have gotten no national media. Like Alex Dyson, former Triple J host, is running in Wannon. There's a poll that says he could unseat the Nationals MP Dan Tin. There's the Teal candidate in the area that I grew up, Paul McCrory, seat of Cowper, that previously was held by Rob Oakeshott, you know, an independent MP who supported Gillard. She's not gotten any national media. Like, what is her focus on this election? So it's weird that we're 4 days away from these people being the most powerful people in Australian politics. We don't know a lot about them.
The main thing to cap that off, I feel like, is whether it's the independents or the Greens or whatever, I feel like there's going to be a lot of newsrooms and journalists in the country who wake up on Sunday wishing that they had a lot more contacts and had done a lot more stories on a lot of these candidates. Because as you say, they're going to be the ones who are deciding who forms minority government.
Okay. All right, we're going to take another quick break, and then we're going to get into the media's grand plan to end racism. Scott, here's a quote for you. Last week, News Corp's executive chairman, Michael Miller, said, "Rise in racial hatred in Australia is unprecedented, unacceptable, and unworthy of our great nation." Now, for legal reasons, I won't dissect that statement too specifically from Mr. Miller, but I would just encourage everyone to reflect on the hilarity and absurdity of a figure associated with News Corp moralizing the public about the rise in racism and how worthy or unworthy it might be of Australia as a nation. But the statement was made in the context of the launch of this new campaign backed by News Corp and Nine. It's fronted by former Labor Senator Nova Paris, who has kind of spent the last 18 months rebranding herself as a pro-Israel advocate. The campaign's called Stand Up to Hate. It's a very vague campaign, honestly. There's very few specifics there beyond stopping racial hatred. And alongside
We love that,
Nova
though.
Paris,
We love that.
You love this too. Alongside Nova Paris, there are a couple of other ambassadors for the campaign, including your guy, Carl Sandilands.
My guy.
You're a Kyle guy, man. Come on, don't hide from that. Don't hide from that. You're like, your thing is it's Jackie O who's the baddie here because you hate women in powerful roles in media. Is that right?
That is not my take. That is not my take. I think he's a Sydney icon.
And alongside Kyle is Melbourne icon Eddie Maguire. Eddie Maguire, famously the former president of the Collingwood Football Club, with, some could say, a checkered legacy of racial issues and racism, is one of the 12 ambassadors for the Stand Up to Hate campaign. This campaign received an endorsement from the Prime Minister, who said it was great. The big media companies are trying to stop racism in Australia. Now, we could talk about the deep irony of News Corp, an organisation that maybe bears more responsibility for corroding Australian society and sowing division than maybe any other organisation in the country, and them launching an anti-racism campaign. But that feels maybe a bit too easy, a bit too obvious. So instead, I want to talk about Nine's involvement, particularly given pretty grim recent events where a group of far-right activists booed and heckled a welcome to country ceremony on Anzac Day in Melbourne. It's easy to write this stuff off as fringe behaviour, but it's actually not occurring in a vacuum, and there has been a big mainstream conversation about welcome to country ceremonies happening at Nine. One of Nine's most high-profile employees, Tom Elliott, who hosts 3AW's morning show, has been on a rampage against welcome to country ceremonies since at least last year. He's called them divisive, and even after the Anzac Day events, he said on his show, "I don't believe we should be having welcome to country at a dawn service. The thing about welcome to country is we do it too often." And as well as that, you've got the Nine newspapers, The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald, running ads on their front page from Clive Palmer's party, the Trumpet of Patriots, including on Anzac Day, that attack welcome to country ceremonies. So I'm kind of wondering, how seriously are we supposed to be taking either of these companies, but I guess particularly Nine, when they're trying to brand themselves as anti-racist champions? It just seems like pretty bizarre.
Yeah, and the thing, well, particularly when you talk about the Nine newspapers' kind of connection to this, the ad that they printed from Clive Palmer on their front page on Anzac Day, that ad that said, "We don't need to be welcomed to our own country," they printed that knowing that thousands of welcome to country ceremonies are going to happen on Anzac Day at all of the dawn services, not just the one in Melbourne where this kind of booing incident happened, but surely they know that is going out on a morning where thousands of welcome to country is happening.
And the booing have said they were applauding Palmer for pushing the Overton window to this space. Even if they weren't sitting down and deciding to do this strategically, it is not a coincidence that you've got Clive Palmer, the far right, all finding their own ways into this conversation about decrying welcome to country ceremonies.
Yeah, and this hasn't gone unnoticed, Oz, by subscribers and readers to the Nine newspapers. I think the Nine newspapers were inundated with a few complaints and cancellations of subscriptions on Friday, and it's not the first time that this kind of link to these kind of messages and what kind of messages go out at Nine has kind of come up. It's worth talking about because I guess it sort of explains how the hell, why that ad ended up on the front page on Anzac Day. But it's not the first time. Back on March 11, The Age also carried a front page ad for Palmer, and that one said, "There are only two genders, male and female." That ad actually copped so much criticism that Clive Palmer later apologised for it at the National Press Club, and he said it should have said, "There are only two sexes."
Great
whether that's a
clarification,
vast
Clive.
improvement,
Thanks.
who knows? But, what's sort of interesting is that Palmer apologised for that ad. Nine management, who printed it on their front page, did not. Actually, what happened was, editors seemed, we can maybe imply that they predicted that when they went to print that ad, their readers might not be happy, because on the same day they ran a story about the backlash against that ad on the same front page as the ad ran. And they also that day had an editorial criticising him and his campaign and the tone of it. Nevertheless, they did print it. And at the time, staff were concerned enough, and as back on this day in March, subscription cancellations came in, complaints came in, the Union House Committee at the Nine newspapers fired off a letter to management, sort of asking for answers, how this could be printed, whether this, was kind of conducted properly, the decision-making to print this. Management responded to that concern, and it's interesting to talk about this now because I think it, this has to be their reasoning for continuing to print these ads, this Welcome to Country thing they printed on Anzac Day. Nine's executive editor, Luke McElveen, and the managing director of publishing, Tori Maguire, argued it wasn't their place to decide not to run an ad that, quote, is authorised by a representative of a political party registered with the AEC. Now, we can only assume that's still their argument today to any criticism they're getting from subscribers and readers. So, Oz, what do we make of that? Like, we've worked at media companies. We know how they work with advertisers, what they elect to take, what they don't. Do we think they're correct to say that they sort of do not have the right to turn away an ad from a political party?
Let me put this bluntly. It's a completely bullshit argument. And we know this from being on both sides, being people who have tried to place ads, in newspapers from a political context, and being on the media side of things. There are often quite regular conversations about what can go in papers, what should go in papers, down to certain language, certain imagery. This is not a new concept. And even in fact, at the Nine papers, they have rejected certain advertisements before because they don't align with a particular message. We know this because journalists who work at Crikey have been very public in saying when they wanted to buy ads during their legal stoush with News Corp, the Nine papers rejected the placement of those ads. We also know that Nine has a set of advertising standards that are publicized on their website that say that advertising must be decent. It must not portray people or depict material in a manner which discriminates against a person or a section of a community on the basis of race, ethnicity, nationality, gender, age, sexual preference, religion, religious belief. Like, there are rules to what goes in an advertisement in a media company. Of course there are. You can't just run whatever you want to run. And I guarantee you, if there's a phrase that the Nine papers and certain segments of the community have deemed as anti-Semitic and calling for the eradication of Israel from the river to the sea, which is a protest slogan used by, pro-Palestine activists. If those groups wanted to put that ad in the newspaper, I guarantee you the Nine papers would reject it because they argue that it vilifies against a section of the community. So for the editors to say, look, we understand you're uncomfortable, but we actually just don't want to put our thumb on the scale here. It's not true. They clearly want the money that they're getting from Palmer. They should just say that, right? That's the reason for doing it. Don't try to pretend it's a moral stance you're taking to be independent here. I just think that, and I think that we're not the only ones who think this. It's clear that staff at those papers are upset. There's been reporting in The Guardian about that as well. I think, look, they've managed to weather it throughout this campaign, and now the election's nearly done, so it might not be relevant anymore. But I think it's also not surprising that so many Age subscribers and Herald subscribers are acting negatively. How many people do you know who are still paying money to get a print version of the Herald and the Age now that love seeing Clive Palmer's attacks on Indigenous communities on the front page? Surely zero.
Yeah, I think that's the interesting... If we're talking about what happens moving forward from this, I think you're right. They probably weather it. But I think the really interesting thing is, I sort of wonder whether that a lot of the leadership at Nine Entertainment, which now has the newspapers within it, sort of value the fact that this is a subscription business, because we've seen decision after decision on a lot of editorial issues where there's a lot of subscriber complaints, a lot of cancellations come through that we're aware of, that I'm aware of, and the choice is made to support the advertiser or the partner or the member of the Nine family that those complaints are about over subscribers. And it's sort of, does Nine have a different vision of what those papers are? Are they happier to choose their strategic partners, their advertisers, over the subscriber base? And what does that mean for the future of the papers, their scale, their revenue? I think that's really, really interesting. Going back to the beginning of this conversation, it's, if these media companies are fighting a kind of public, or claiming to fight a public awareness campaign about race, there's surely something about what is in the realm of public debate, what is...
Yeah,
and,
totally.
And how do their media companies contribute to what's in the realm of public debate? Is it, the place of Indigenous people to welcome people to country? Is that up for debate? All kinds of things up for debate. So what is their role in kind of where the Overton window sits about this racism that they claim to be fighting against?
Totally. Can you say that you want to run an anti-racism campaign whilst you are putting those messages out there? It seems tricky. Yeah, it seems tricky. Scott, That's it from us. That was fun, right? We had a good time.
I think that was fun. Let's see.
Let's find out. Let's find out what people think.
Let's find
Before
out.
we
Let's
go,
put
there's
it
a
in the
couple
wind
of
tunnel of public opinion.
Before we go, there's a couple of things that we need to mention. Firstly, as I said at the start of the show, we'll be back this Thursday. That'll be our regular release day from now on. If you enjoyed listening to us talk, if you like the episode, we'd love it if you could leave us a review, or even better yet, share it with a friend. Get the word out. We're independent. We don't have the backing of big corporations, so word of mouth is really all we have. Please help get this podcast in front of more people. And if you've got any questions, feedback, or tips for us to look into, you can email us at contact@lamestream.com.au.
I am desperate to get some tip-offs of any fun things heard in newsrooms. If you've heard, no names need to be mentioned, but if you've heard a chief of staff yell across in a panic, a crowded newsroom, I would love that quote. But get in touch with anything, feedback, tips, whatever you like.
And don't forget to go to lamestream.com.au where you can sign up for our weekly newsletter, which will feature exclusive content, breaking news, analysis, and fun recommendations from Scott and I. Also, for anyone in Melbourne, Scott and I are hosting an election night party at the Punters Club in Fitzroy. It's also doubling as our kind of official launch of Lamestream. So come watch the results roll in with other Lamestream fans. We'll celebrate Anthony Green's final ever broadcast, play some tunes, drink some drinks. It'll be a great time. Punters Club in Fitzroy from 7. And finally, a big thank you to the creative team who helped get this show off the ground. Thank you, Lee Aegis from Pullen Arts Club for our design, Kai Hughes for our theme music, and thank you to our legendary producer, Bez Zodair, for making the show. Scott, see you on Thursday.
See you on Thursday. Thank you, Bez. Thank you, everyone who's encouraged us and given us a bit of support along the journey. See you on Thursday.